60 to 70 rock shows a year, from April to about Halloween, and then it's used by the university as well.
Oh, I might need to hit once in the middle. Okay, try it now.
Here's some historic photographs. The complex it has a lot of pieces, but primarily be talking about that U-shaped structure we call the colonnade. Here you see it in plan on the left. That's an historic drawing. I believe it's a John Galen Howard drawing. There was an early rendering by John Galen Howard. John Galen Howard was to Berkeley what Bakewell and Brown were to Stanford, and kind of the university architect that built probably half the campus in his tenure. And you can see that it was quite elaborate. It had this colonnade that wrapped around the seating bowl. That was all value engineered. William Randolph Hearst was the donor, and I guess he just was a little too cheap to do the whole scheme. So value engineering circa 1900, what was this? Early 1900s. I forgot, 1902 and 3. It's John Galen Howard's first building on campus. Julia Morgan had a role as a field superintendent or a field inspector. Neither of them had figured out concrete yet, as we learned in this project. So we're talking about this sort of three-sided, very, very wide U-shaped colonnade. It's about 42 feet high. It's 140 feet long. It says 35 feet wide, but that's really just these end pieces, these kind of re-entrant corners there that give it some, geometry. Instructional engineers like perpendicular geometry. So you have a little bit at the ends, but the middle is it's essentially the aspect ratio, but at its narrowest, it's about 3 feet wide and 40 feet tall. It's like a piece of foam core on end.
Minute plus concrete?
We'll get to that. Then there was an addition built by an architect named Ernest Bourne. Does anyone ring a bell? He was a mid-century modernist, quite a fine architect. He did a beautiful addition to this historic building in the 50s. Lawrence Halpern did the landscaping, and both the original construction by Howard and the Bourne and Halpern work are listed on the National Register. So the whole site has historic significance, both the original and the modification, which I thought is a beautiful example of how to add on to a historic building. Unfortunately, the Bourne edition, as I'll show you in some slides, seriously undermined the original foundations, such as they were, for these columns. And we actually learned that late in the design phase by, I'll show you how we learned it. It was the last building on their campus rated very poor, and it's an assembly use. The concrete, as weak doesn't even describe it. Along the back of the structure, you could scrape it off with your fingernails, and not ruin your fingernails. The PSI turned out to be in the hundreds, measured in the hundreds. Here are some historic pictures. It's possible that woman in the upper left slide is Julia Morgan. We're not sure. What you see in the upper left is the grading of the seating bowl. This was a natural amphitheater in the woods, quite a bit east of the developed campus, and it was actually called. It was a place that the students kind of found and inhabited, and it was named. I think it was the John Weed Amphitheater. He was some undergraduate that led. Which I think is. If you've ever been to a concert there, a deeply prescient name. So the top two are the original construction, and the one on the right is very telling because it showed some construction sequence. They built the columns, and then they built the panels infill it, and they didn't really connect them. They built them like you would build a door, where the panel actually is sort of in a dado and it floats. Not sure why they did that. The bottom drawings are the Bourne and Halpern drawings, and so he did this very modern, very severe, low-slung addition to the west. And here you see it kind of in action. That's probably a graduation. So it leads multiple lives. It has this revenue-generating concert business that essentially funds Cal performances. So they use this facility. It makes a lot of money. They pay rent to the university, and it finances their quite substantial cultural program through Cal performances. And if you've ever been to Zellerbach Hall, your ticket was probably partially subsidized by the concert operations. The photographer, who I believe is Katie Gutierrez from our office, on this shot is probably standing pretty close to, if not on, the Hayward Fault. So there you have a key player in this drama. The other thing you can see here is it holds about 8,000 people. And there's kind of two ways in and out. Let's just have a little, what did I do? Is there a pointer?
Yeah, it's in the middle. Push the center.
There's kind of two little throats here, right? Here and here, that are the major ingress and egress. So one could imagine if something bad happened and people were trying to get out and one of these came down, or one of these big end walls came down, you'd have a catastrophe. So the egress here. There are other ways out, but most people come in that way, and as any fire marshal will tell you, people come in, they go out the same way they come in a panic, even if there's a safer way. Here you are standing on the stage, getting a sense of scale. That's about 40-some feet here. And as I said, the top, at the roof here, you can walk on the roof, but it's no wider than this square of concrete, 3 or 4 feet. I had to walk on the roof, and I wasn't happy. That picture, I'm working on Hoover Tower right now, and luckily I didn't have to do the exterior surveys of that. She showed that guy in the bucket from the crane. Make my staff do that. So what happens here? Crosby, Stills, and Nash. They used to do theater. They obviously have university functions, and then they'd light giant fires. Right? They did that right after we finished. Really, you're gonna pop off all the plaster repair we did, but apparently they do that. So what's wrong here? Well, as I said earlier, here's the Hayward Fault. Here's the theater. Here's the colonnade. I don't want to reveal the punchline, but as part of our testing, we looked for rebar, and we looked for any metal in the building, and there were none. There's not a stick of rebar in this entire structure, and the PSI is in the hundreds. These are some of these walls at the retaining for the amphitheater seating. I'm not going to really get into that. So we have major earthquake damage. The finishes were cracking and spalling, very poor concrete, very bad geometry, just the basic building. And then all the things that come with a project, even if you're doing a voluntary seismic project, then you have all the accessibility burden that the building code requires. So we were actually able to provide accessibility to the stage and the backstage and the performers area, and the seating bowl, as well as putting in showers and better accommodations for the performers. We're told that Bonnie Raitt really is very grateful for our project. Here's an overall site plan, and here is the portion that we're looking at. And you can see here are these kind of corners that are helpful. Here, look how thin that is. There's basically columns and then those infill panels and then a roof that's about 4 feet wide. But there's one area in the middle that's thicker. And that will play a prominent role in our drama here today. And of course, then there's also some little thicker areas here and here. It's a little hard to see. There, the Bourne addition Born Identity, we called it. This was right in the height of those movies coming out. There's basically a subterranean addition that goes from here all the way to here, kind of wraps the building, wraps this U-shaped colonnade with a U-shaped subterranean addition. And they, I'll show you in a minute that they didn't really shore it. So here is a kind of a backstage terrace that's at the same level of the stage, but there's a story below it. And then there's a whole network of paths that Halpern did on both sides. Here's the seating bowl, and then there's an upper lawn. Here are those little throats of exiting where you have to get out through about a 20-foot wide area. And if anything happened, even if some piece of ornament fell down, it would have been catastrophic there. Right now, actually, we're working on a freestanding building out here to provide restrooms, because there's about 20 restrooms for 8,000 people. Here's a section, and this section is cut through the thicker part right here. So it actually gives a little bit of a misleading idea of how thick the building is. In generally, between these fat middle parts, the building is only that wide. But also see these funny spaces here. The original drawing showed these rather large voids that we were very interested in. David Marr was the structural engineer. If any of you know him, he's quite a brilliant man. And we collaborated really closely on this. And he was very interested in finding out where these voids, because he wanted to be able to calculate the mass of this building down to the gnat's eyelash. And I was really interested in those voids of finding places to put in the reinforcement that he would want. Get a sense of the topography. It was a natural bowl, but it had been regraded. You can see here's the Born edition and the cut that they did. And so they're down below the footings here. And here's that terrace, and then the Born building has a sort of two-story bulkhead buildings on either side. It also was a natural water course because it was a natural amphitheater. So there's basically an aquifer running under here, which we discovered really liked our elevator pit. This was had been a study that Tipping Martin had done with Page and Trimble, I believe, before we got the project. Berkeley likes to do things in stages, so they often commission a study and then they commission a project after that. And I think the first team thought they were going to get it. Oftentimes that's just a kind of an audition for the real project if you do a good job. And I think we were able to win this project by proposing a very, very extensive testing and investigation phase preceding the actual design. This was a scheme, and I think this was one of those schemes that they asked for to scare the living daylights out of the powers that be. This was a early scheme to brace this, and this is not a temporary solution. This is a sort of an outrigger scheme off the back, the west face. So if you're in the bowl, you wouldn't see it, but if you're driving by on Gailey Road, you sure would. And everyone kind of shuddered at this, and I think this was one of these schemes that helped inspire them to really want to do a better solution. That's what it would have looked like. So we had an interview for this project, and we came in, we did a lot of research on investigation methods and potential retrofit methods. And came in and said, you need to devote a six-figure budget to purely testing and investigation. And we outlined the ways that we thought they should do that. And we did that working with David Marr and with some contractor buddies of mine at Blank Construction. And we came in, and I think that's how we sort of snatched this project from the previous team. And what did we want to find out? We needed to really understand the geometry of the building better, where these voids were, how much mass was in the building. We needed to know what the footings, depth, and proportions were, the material properties of soil, concrete. We needed to understand this is a unreinforced building with a parch coat of plaster, cement plaster over it. We had to do a very extensive survey of how the skin was behaving and why and where it was failing. And then we're very interested in these voids as pathways for reinforcing, but some of those early photos showed us that there was likely form, like the columns are hollow, but that they probably abandoned the formwork. And so what good would they be if they're full of debris? So we really wanted to look inside these voids and find out, are they useful? So even though this talk is supposed to be about non-invasive and high-tech methods, I'm gonna probably here to say that we certainly did that, but we did it in conjunction with more what I would call semi-invasive and truly invasive. So we put together a program that used all three methodologies. The side that faces Gailey, the west side, the whole plaster parch coat was failing, and we knew we were going to have to replace that. So we could kind of go to town on that side. We needed to poke holes, that's where we did it. We didn't do almost anything on the kind of stage side, which is really the ornamental side. So what were the non-invasive methods we used? We used ground penetrating, there's a word missing here. We used ground penetrating radar and scanned the entire building to try and map these voids. And for the life of me, both our office and Mars' office looked for the printout for that to try and find it, and we couldn't. And I apologize for that, but it basically gave us an idea of where the voids were and how they correlated with the drawings that we had. And from that, Mars' office did a very careful calculation of the weight and the mass of the building. Of course, we used kind of what I would call old-fashioned technology of X-rays and pentameter scanning for the rebar, and we got skunked there. There was none. There was some metal in the building, but it was like form tied, things like that. So that was extraordinary. Nobody expected that. We didn't think a building could stand up.
Chris, was it damaged after 1906? Because you said this was built in 1902 or 03, right?
No, not that we found any evidence of.
And the logo created was free.
Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah. But when's the last one on the Hayward Fault? We had access to the site, so we were able to get JLGs out there and kind of do traditional sounding and tapping of both the applied ornament and on the east side, and then just the plaster veneer. And we found extensive delamination where the whole thing just peeled off. Did a crack map, a visual crack assessment and map. And then finally, what I would call the ultimate non-invasive technique is we spent a lot of time in the archives and looked for construction photos. And that plays and unfortunately we didn't do that soon enough, because that plays a key role in this drama. We found a photograph late that really influenced the scope. So Mars' office actually put together, and at the point he was with Tipping Mar, now he's off on his own. We actually did a set of construction documents for this. It cost over $100,000. We mobilized a general contractor and did a set of construction documents just for the testing. And so here's a sampling of some of them. The ground penetrating radar in the upper right. We did test pits. We did some column coring, and I'll talk about that a little later, and did some bore scoping. Did a very detailed crack and spall map from up close. We didn't use a drone, we used a JLG. here you see the voids that were shown in the original drawings. Our investigations show they didn't quite come out that well, you know, quite that crisp, and so we were able to get a better idea of really how much concrete was in there, and what was in there. Was it full of junk and debris? And there's a close-up plan showing interesting spaces. These were ventilation shafts. That was how you got up to the roof, actually. And then each column was hollow. And then there was sort of a storage area here. Now, the original scheme that came after that outrigger scheme was both we and Mar thought, well, gosh, what we really need to do is center core all these columns and get like a 16-inch diameter post-tension pier down there from the foundation to the roof. And because we have so many of them, that will be like a picket fence, you know, with a fence post every 4 or 5 feet. And so we spent a lot of time on that and a lot of effort on this testing. Interestingly enough, it wasn't till later that we started paying attention to these spaces that were kind of very obvious to us. But we wanted to go down the road of like, let's reinforce the entire thing. And by the way, Mars office is doing these models, these computer simulations and they run an earthquake and it shows the building, how it's moving and where the key deflections are, and so therefore where the key stresses are. And I don't have any of those because they're not that relevant to this topic, but it was like watching the photos of Galloping Gertie, you know, the famous bridge that failed. There was also, quite frankly, we also had to be a little careful about any of this getting out to the public, as the building was in use, and the university was kind of saying, "Oh shit, you know, this is a liability waiting to happen." So we had to kind of keep it to ourselves. Here you see this sort of interesting construction of they built the columns and they left a sort of a keyway, and then they poured these panels later, and all they had was this key. There was no doweling, no physical connection. And remember, this concrete, I'm scraping it away with my fingers.
Excuse me, can I make a comment on that? I think that the reason they built it that way with unfilled panels, because if it were cast as a one continuous piece, it would be cracked up like hell. To avoid cracking, you probably, in unreinforced concrete, you need to do that.
Yeah, that could be. I don't have any experience of how you do it with unreinforced concrete, so that could be.
Not
Yeah.
much.
On your drawing there, is that void in the column, is that to scale? Because it's, at that size, it's really not saving any concrete or anything.
I don't know. I think so. Those original photos I showed with the, I'll show them again. I think they're coming up here. Of the original formwork, it's pretty good size. Oh, there you have it. That looks like outer forms to me. So you're not seeing the inner core. And there you see the bowl being constructed. They used, there's we think Julie Morgan. They used donkeys to drag plows to compact the soil. Another part of the project that's not relevant there, the soil underneath the bowl, it's subsided, so we drilled some holes through the seat benches, and there's 2 feet of void, and that's all unreinforced too. But it has sort of a zigzag, you know, it's a Z pattern, so it has some geometry that kind of holds it up. And if it fails, it's gonna settle a couple of feet. It's not quite as catastrophic. Now these 2 photos are, you know, circa turn of the century. This photograph is in the 50s, and this is the Bourne edition going in. Anybody see any shoring anywhere? No. They've completely undermined these footings. We didn't find these pictures until design development. We were already going through the seismic advisory group at at Berkeley. And once they saw this, we had to do a whole round of analysis, and they basically determined that the column footings, the footings beneath each one of those columns were so severely undermined that we had to then go back in and underpin each column, which we thought we would do by cutting holes in the back of the bourne. We didn't have the luxury of having a general contractor who was going to build it. This was a hard bid job. So here, when we work at Stanford, the general contractor is often hired when we are, and so we have that expertise to have somebody from Hathaway, Dinwiddie, or DevCon or Plant sitting next to us saying, "Well, how do you want to build this?" Here we had to make an assumption, so we had to undermine these columns, and we ended up having to do it. We thought through the basement, and the general contractor had a different idea, which I'll show you in a minute. So unfortunately, this was kind of a smoking gun photograph that changed the scope dramatically after design development. It really taught us a lesson to do all your investigations, even the archival ones earlier. So what did we do here? We talked about the sort of non-invasive. Now let's get into things that actually left a mark. And I left them into semi-invasive. Think arthroscopic surgery instead of open knee surgery. We did bore scoping to look into all these hollows. And then because we were really interested in using this, we were thinking that every column would be our strong point, is we wanted to prototype if we wanted to get like a 16-inch diameter core. Is that feasible? And then we did sort of old-fashioned invasive. We dug test pits to determine footing depths and their shapes, and then took a ton of core samples of concrete to break them. But we did so off the back of the building, which got reparched. It actually got fiber wrapped with carbon fiber and then reparched. So the bore scoping, again, we had to do kind of construction documents of how to do it. So you can see there's a port. So this is the stage side. This is the west side. You can see there's almost no ornament on it. And right up there,
Yeah, the online people are asking for me to point out things that you're pointing out. So,
so it's up here, a little port, and then there's a port down here to also look in. Any of you who have had knee surgery might recognize these looks. It's the same technology that they use to look into pipes. Is this the video?
oh, we may need to play it separate from the.
Yeah, no, I think you have to stop. So this is actually, why don't we go and, okay, that's my cue to play the video.
Okay.
You're completely in charge of.
I'm gonna try to do this backwards here.
This is like, it's a long one. We'll just listen for, and then you can hear some narration. So I think they're starting at the bottom. You can see debris there. I'm going to resist the obvious medical analogy here. People of a certain age will understand. You see that it's really irregular. You don't really know how they formed it. This is going down a column. And in a minute, you'll see some, I think, some formwork left over.
Why would they move it at all?
I don't know. I think they did it in lifts, and they probably reused it.
Oh, there's the narration.
Yeah.
Say this is about where we
we show what we're excited to.
Nick Peterson talking, our project manager. Crazy.
Oh, yeah. Have it sing along like the engineer's gonna get scared. Look at that.
Let the
Yeah,
reminder
you
get
see
it.
that.
Wow.
At some point here, let's do 48.
I'm trying to think, how could a cord drill get through that?
I mean, where
The place comes with a vibrator probably.
This is what was making a problem between the grinders. If you think routing all the way like this, oh, it's bucking like crazy, yeah. So, now we're getting up to where they, and then we're just breaking out from the drilling program, getting loose and then pulling down. Yeah. Was it core of the bottom drilled first? Yes, the core was done first and then a follow on to grind that did all this. And you can see it's enlarged, just it's rattling around, it enlarged the pilot ball, and then it ground. This.
And that portion is actually.
And then this, was that where the cleanout was? Yeah. So we're 10 feet out, yeah, that should be about where the cleanout is.
I think there's one portion where you actually see a piece of formwork left. I don't know when that occurs. It's not, trust me, it's not the most
So
traumatic.
this was after core drilling?
That was, I think they tried a little bit of core drilling. So based upon the first bore scopes, this is the only video we had, we found that there was these voids and they had some debris in them and some irregularities. And then, anyone who is in the drilling business tells you what they like is kind of uniformity, whatever they drill. If they hit a rock, it's a big deal. If they hit a void, it's a big deal. If they're partially in a void. So after the video, then we did a prototype of trying to center core one of these things. And it's pretty easy to get a small diameter and get down to the bottom of 3 or 4 inches. Because for the most part, it would just go down to the bottom almost to the footing, and it didn't have much in its way. But to try and get something where you could drop a rebar cage down there and get some real action, I don't remember what the diameter was, but they couldn't get more than 20, 30 feet down, and then the thing was just going crazy. So what that did was put a stake in the heart of that original scheme, which was great. I mean, if we had just designed this thing and got into construction, it would have been a disaster. So this immediately said, boy, we better look for another answer. I also should say that we had a construction window of, we had to start in November after the big game bonfire, which never gets canceled, apparently. And we had to finish by the Beach Boys concert in May and the graduation. So we had about a 5 or 6 month window through the winter. And then, thank God it was the driest winter, I think, in the last 10 years. Almost no rain. You hear those guys actually center coring. So this is not quite non-invasive, but it did isolate. We took a little bit of the roof off and just went to town on one area, and it was essentially it made the project. If we hadn't done this, we would have gone down the wrong road. This is simply a map of the. This is conventional coring to get concrete samples. So what ended up happening? It's a little funny because it's kind of blindingly obvious. We ended up utilizing these existing pathways here, 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 and here. These were essentially storage closets that they let us have half of. And then we put these red squares are the footings, which you'll see they're incredibly massive, and even they even have piers underneath them to resist the loads. We ended up still center coring every column, but we did so with like a 3-inch bit to get down into the foundation, and we dropped a single, I think, number 10 bar, and filled it up with grout. So all that was doing wasn't really helping the building, it was just restraining the column for out of plane in both directions, just holding it together. So all it was doing was local. The real work was being done by these sort of 4 strong columns and 4 very large footings. These footings were pretty easy to do. We dug out the stage, dropped it about a story, drilled the piers, and built these massive footings. These footings involved doing underpinning underneath the existing structure. And then at every column, because we had discovered that photograph of the Bourne construction in the 50s, they had to underpin that. And instead of accessing it from the back at the level of the basement, the contractor elected to mine underneath the footings and do it from the stage side. Here you see that basically in section, there's a section through one of these guys. And I can't tell you why that one is bigger than that one. It had to do, I think, with the soil characteristics were a little different because it's a completely symmetrical building. I should have asked David before this. Here it is in section, this gigantic footing that's right underneath the stage. Here's the Bourne edition. We just thought when they had to go in, and the section doesn't go through the columns, but if we had to get to the bottom of the column, they just poke a hole in this wall and go that way. They ended up deciding to mine down underneath it here. I have a photograph of it. But here's one of the giant footing, and then that strong column that goes through that center void. And then up here, there's a bond beam that's poured along the entire roof that also utilizes one of these voids. So we didn't have to remove that material. We were able to get reinforcing in that. And that's kind of the stiff collar that attaches these 4 strong columns together and restrains the movement. I'm about on schedule, I think. Here's some construction photographs. There they are, drilling the piers, the stage. They haven't actually dropped the stage level yet. This will come later. This is the rebar from one of these strong columns dropping into that slot. There I am looking down it. There are some of these voids that we found, some of which we used for that yoke. We call it a yoke beam. They're the footings, those 2 asymmetrical footings at the center. So they're about 8 feet deep on top of a piers. Here's the mining operation. These guys under the columns. So you're already 8 feet down, and then they dug these mining pits below the columns. It was extraordinary. You'd go down there and you felt like you were a coal miner. Yeah.
So that's where this number 10 bars.
No, it's well below that. The number 10 bars stop way up here.
And then into what?
Into the bottom of the existing footing.
Okay.
Which is, number 10, again, this is not a section through a column, but they would end about right here.
Mm-hmm.
That mining operation is down here.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where they dropped the stage down to build this footing. So they were down another 10, 12 feet. So they were down like 22 feet below stage level. Overa was the general contractor, did a remarkable job, and their subcontractor, I think, Alta, ring a bell. They're sort of foundation guys. Alta, I see there. Those guys were amazing. All the trouble we had on this job, all the bickering we did, ended up being about the concrete paving and things like that. It was all the easy stuff is what we ended up in a finger pointing match. The really hard stuff, Overa did an incredible job. There's one of those big footings poured. And you can see that they're starting to excavate for the footing underneath this guy. This is where the other, you know, so you have 1, 2, 3, and then 4. It's just taken from the roof. That's looking down one of these voids here. We had a circular void and they took half of it. And there's the rebar cages waiting to go in. There's one of them in the video time.
Here we go.
Because we had mapped this so well and planned it out so well, when they dropped these enormous cages with very densely populated steel into these very narrow voids, it went in like without a hitch. It actually took them longer to back the truck into the area than it did for them to set the columns. So this was a great day.
Oh, wow.
You see all the area here that doesn't have any ties, that's because that's the depth of that yoke beam and the steel would be field set through that.
Were they welded this cage?
No.
No.
Hey, Nick. Wasn't quite that fast, but it was pretty. So there you have, you know, 2 icons of the campus. This was our first. We had done a bunch of studies at first for Berkeley, these feasibility studies. This was our first construction project. So it's kind of like your first job on this campus, and they give you, you know, one of the icons. So it was a nerve-wracking experience. Back to this. This isn't really part of my presentation, but we ended up having to pin back these very tall trapezoidal walls of the amphitheater. We soil nail them back, then fiber wrapped them in the classroom. So they don't fall on you when you're trying to run out. And there you have it, back in action. Last slide. It was a real thrill. I mean, the stakes couldn't have been higher for us, you know, at the firm, but also it's a Nick's blessing to have your first job be on one of the most beloved and difficult buildings on campus. But I'm really proud of it. Came
Is
out
that the
well.
Beach Boys concert?
That's actually a band called Bon Iver. I'm a fairly big music fan, and so we did a lot of field observation because I mentioned at the beginning we had an ADA obligation or an accessibility obligation, and we also the donor for the project is involved with the concert promoter, so we were able to parlay kind of that ancillary scope into quite a programmatic improvement for the performers and the support. We put in a freight elevator that also provided accessibility for people, but they could move equipment up and down. And you know, concert productions are a big deal, and so we would do on-site observations from, you know, trucks would show up at 7 in the morning. They'd load in, they'd set up, soundtrack, and then see a show. And I'd always pick bands that I really liked when we did those things. And you get to have a dinner down with the crew. And first time we did that, I was down there and with my client Perloff walked in. I hadn't met him yet, and he was talking to Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin, who was playing that night, and I was sitting there like, yes, Mr. Plant. And then so I did that 3 or 4 times, and it was really fun. And I'm going to do it again because we're working on a restroom building for him. So, it was a great deal of fun, great deal of stress, and I'm really proud of it. So, thanks for your attention. I'll take any questions.
So did you replaster the entire thing?
Just the west side. The scope there, the concrete was so bad. We couldn't get a way to dowel those panels into the columns. We fiber wrapped the whole thing, literally from the base to the top, with carbon fiber and epoxy, and then we reparched over that. That was a very difficult to get the finish right. It was a real fight, and if you see it in some lights, some very harsh grazing lights, we could have done better. There was a lot of fiber wrap. We fiber wrapped those end walls of the bowl, and then we fiber wrapped the entire back. That's not what that stuff's usually used for. You know, it's usually for column confinement. It was just kind of like strong wallpaper to hold all that together.
Was anything done with the different?
Yeah. Let me see if I can find a photo.
And you're hoping it's not gonna eliminate.
Oh, I hope all for a lot more than that. Hope springs eternal in this business. Otherwise, you can't sleep at night. These guys, medallions, were actually, I don't know, they're about this thick, and they were bricks. This is something that wasn't on the drawings. We assumed that they maybe were cast in place or something, or precast things. They put brick up there in a circle, and then they plastered it, and the brick was just glued on. That was one of the things we discovered when we did some, and so we did about each one of these has, I think, 5 stainless steel pins, and then we had very small holes. And then there's what we call the, I'm sure there's a classical term for all this, which I apologize, but I don't know. There are these things that, you see these? They look like Legos. Now those were precast, and they have these little dots on them. You're a conservator, you probably know what those are. And those that were stuck on, so we did the same thing to the Legos. Which that's not the classical term. And that's about it on this space, and it was high up, so very little on the decorative side. Yes.
When does rebar come into common use for projects like this?
I'm gonna ask the structural engineers in the
Early
audience.
1900s. I'm probably certainly in the 20s and the 10s and teens. And I think actually the old camp building we saw before was either was the first reinforced concrete building.
No, it's not. It's not Old Chemistry Museum, which is right next door.
Okay.
Which about the same era.
Yeah, so turn of the century.
So it was kind of a discretionary thing at this time. They weren't really familiar with it.
Well, there wasn't a code until 1927.
I mean, but it was not required.
You know what we discovered? I sort of took a cheap shot at John Galen Howard and Morgan by saying they didn't really have their concrete act together. Maybe that's true or not. What we found is that the strength and the consolidation and the sort of homogeneity of the mix was much higher at the top. And what would happen is they would build these forms up a certain area, and they would just dump the concrete in, and it would kind of, what's the term, deconsolidate. So at the bottom you got a lot of rock, a lot of aggregate, and not a lot of cement. At the top it didn't have to fall as far. They were literally just dumping it. And some of the forms were pretty deep. I don't know how high the lifts were, but they were pretty cool. So that had a lot to do, and there was a spectrum of strength as you went up the building, and it would depend on what we thought was the sequencing.
Did David ever consider like base isolation scheme on this to kind of take some of the demands, seismic demands off the slow strike unreinforced concrete?
Not when he had he did the study prior, and that wasn't, which I knew inside and out, and it wasn't considered then, and it wasn't considered afterwards. Maybe if Pharrell was on the job, then.
Yeah.
I mean, David. I don't think David's known for that, but he's, I think, known for his incredible modeling, which he did, and he. All the guys on the seismic review committee were all his master's advisors. So those guys got talking, and I would just go get coffee. I don't know what the hell they were talking about.
It's still interesting to me that you said, even though it's not reinforced and it's early concrete technology and in the hundreds PSI, that there wasn't major damage during 1906 or Loma Prieta, which makes me think, so structurally what was working for this?
Luck.
What were those that,
I think it was primarily luck.
in Japan, they rely on the bending and moving.
It's not a ductal structure, though. I mean,
So-
that's the problem. Is this is a non-ductal. I mean, if this thing really got a good flex, it was gonna the motion, as you can imagine, just from the geometry, the sort of little reentrant corners, it's pretty stiffer right here, and in the middle, it was like a sine wave. And a little bit more stiffness in the middle because it had a little bit more thickness, where we ended up putting in the columns. But then the deflection was just this crazy sine wave, and it didn't take much. And it wasn't a ductal failure; it was a non-ductal failure, so catastrophic. Like it would go and go, and then it was collapse, not crack, not partial collapse. It was full on.
Do you know if David ran the 1906 time history through his model? Did he actually look to try to estimate where big damage would have occurred in 1906?
I don't remember that. He might have.
Could I add a comment, just because there's so many structural engineers in the room? You had mentioned the fiberglass wrap.
Right.
For another project, I did a lot of materials research, and so far in the US, I could not find, because a lot of times we use it for brick walls or something stabilized. I could not find a breathable material. All I could find were resin-based fiberglass in the US. In Italy, I found a material. It's pozzolana cement base with an integrated mesh system that allows a little bit more breathability.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried it on a small, like a mural factory. It was a Riverdale something. I just was fascinated that they figured that out because they had used it to cover like a church dome at one point also for seismic strengthening. I'm not an engineer, but I just found that pretty fascinating to be able to find something that was semi-breathable material rather than
There's
what
not.
we have here in the US is all resin.
Nothing's getting through that. So if there's water getting into this thing, we'll see if it causes problems. It hasn't yet.
Are you arbor archaeology?
I think.
Let
me see if I can.
But it was just interesting to me that I could find nothing comparable in the United States.
Yeah. It's not really, we're sort of hijacking that technology from some other use for this. It's not really intended for this. I'm trying to find a picture of the roof originally was just concrete, and obviously they'd had trouble with water getting in through the top. So it's during the Bourne project, they actually put this copper roof on the top, and the roof overhangs both walls, so it actually, I think, protects, it's keeping water out of getting from the top. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of water soaking into this building and then trying to get out through the back. But if it is, it ain't getting out. So maybe I'll be giving you a talk in 10 years about the failure. I don't know.
There's no rebar to corrode, so you're all right.
Right.
Exactly. Mixed blessing. Okay. Any others?
None from online.
All right,
So thank you.
thank you.